Over the years, scholarship has often explored the growing role played by women such as Jane Austen in publishing during the 18th century and beyond. Yet there is another area of writing that provides a fascinating insight into their lives. Today, we're going to look at letter writing in the 18th century. Hello, my name is Gareth Edwards and welcome to the Untitled History Podcast. Join me each week alongside world-leading experts as we take a deep dive into your favourite topics from throughout history. From the ancient world to the modern, and with plenty of historical rabbit holes in between, we'll cover famous and not so famous moments in history from all across the globe. In 1740, Samuel Richardson published Pamela, a novel purporting to be the letters of a young woman. In 1748, he followed this up with Clarissa, written on the same principle. These publications showed the fascination that even at the time existed around women and letter writing. But both Richardson's subjects were fake. The activity he showed them engaged in, though, was very real. The creation of reliable and regular postal services after the English Civil War led to an explosion in letter writing, especially for women. Through letters, they could build and maintain relationships, share opinions on society or politics, and generally reflect on life, just as we do today through messaging platforms or social media. Indeed, the intimacy and information contained within those letters could even provoke questions on how those letters should be handled after their death. Collections of those letters which do survive provide historians with a remarkable insight into the lives of people, and particularly women, within this period. And to help me explore this subject today on the pod is Natasha Simonova. Say hello, Natasha.
Hello.
So, for those unfamiliar with her work, Dr. Natasha Simonova is a writer and academic specialising in English literature in the long 18th century. We could have an entire episode on debating what the long 18th century is. She is currently working on a book called The Grey Ladies, The Secret Lives of 18th Century Women. And that was one of the reasons I think why you're perfect for this episode, because we'll get on to who those ladies were in a bit. But thank you so much for coming on, because this is such a, to me, fascinating and unexplored area, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry.
for listeners, and you really want to be watching this one, because this is going to be a double tortie episode. Both of us have tortie cats, and both tortie cats are definitely going to make their presence aware. So normally we manage to get away with both myself and the guest avoiding mentioning cats when they appear, but be aware there will be cats on this one. So if that's of interest, whilst also discussing 18th century letters, do tune into the YouTube or Spotify video versions as well.
There are quite a lot of cats in 18th century letters as well. Not only do people mention cats getting in the way while they're trying to write. One of the letters that I've got is actually, it's meant to be signed by the family cat, and they often give updates on the various doings. So this is universal, cats interrupting.
I think that's almost the wonderful thing about letters from this period and beyond is I think they make human beings of our subjects. They give you an insight into that side of things, and they let you know what people are thinking behind the scenes almost as much as in front of the scenes, in polite terms, don't they?
Yeah, so it gives us a new perspective on historical events when people mention how they react to things as they happen. But also it gives us an insight into what people felt and their relationships and just generally how they interacted with the world. And that's why epistolary novels were so popular in this period, because it gives us that illusion of that intimate access in a fictional form. So clearly this is something that people were eager to read and wanted more of.
Yeah, I think that's, again, one of the reasons I find this really, really interesting is because, as you say, the literary form has to reflect a reality, because that's what makes it familiar, that's what makes it popular. Like, they have to be engaged in that activity for it to feel familiar when they're reusing a novelized version of that. So let's set the scene for people here. So we are talking, to begin with, about the 17th century. We kind of move beyond that as we go forward. We move into the 18th century, and then actually one of the people we will talk about actually lives into the 19th century. So this is an ongoing thing that continues for some time. But to understand that, listeners, I think you almost have to understand that throughout all those periods we've talked about, the postal service has existed in some form. the Postal Service comes into being after the English Civil War in a very real way, in a first sort of permanent way. And like, I'll give a rough overview here of what that really means in reality, which is you're not talking necessarily about door-to-door delivery to the level that you might see today, but you are seeing an element of where you've got post towns. People are moving post between those towns. There is an infrastructure to support this. The penny post already exists, which means within certain limits, there are controls on pricing. Not always. Once you move beyond certain areas, you're going to pay more. But we're pre-mail coach. So bear that in mind. If you listen to the earlier episode on highwaymen, we are pre-mail coach here for most of this period. So you're actually looking at situations where mail is being moved by what are often referred to as boys on horseback, carrying mail bags. And then that evolves over time into the mail coach. But the important thing is post is moving around the country. If you want to write a letter to someone who is nearby, you can do so. But if you want to write to someone who is far away, you have a reasonably solid chance that letter is going to reach them, whether they're on holiday, whether they're at a country estate. The system exists now for regular, reliable correspondence, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly. I mean, people were writing letters to each other going back to kind of antiquity. But what changes in the late 17th century is that it becomes much more accessible. You don't need to have your own messenger to carry post. There is a system that will get it there for you. And the Royal Mail, as it's called, starts off being just for the government and the king. But then after the Restoration, it opens up for the wider public. And that really changes the role that letters play in people's lives because it becomes much more widespread. And as you say, you can write a letter being reasonably confident it's going to get there. You can't be entirely confident it's not going to get opened along the way, which is something that they acknowledge. But there is a system in place. And actually, in many places, particularly London, the post was a great deal faster and more reliable than it is today. You would get multiple posts per day. So this was really a way of communicating quickly and keeping those relationships going, even across quite long distance within England and Britain, but also you have letters being sent across the continent. And people have studied the way that this facilitates scientific networks at this time and knowledge networks. But for the women I study, it's particularly facilitating friendships and family relationships, including with aristocratic women or women in general. When they get married, they tend to move away from their families, and therefore they rely on that as a way of continuing to keep in touch.
So let's talk about and dig into that a bit, which is, this is, as you say, one of the key areas in which they're able to do that, because we also have lots of letters that are examples of men writing and everything else. And we have lots of business letters. And one of my favorite weird side facts is actually if you were an MP, you got to send post for free, which was preserved throughout all of this period until everyone realized that this was being massively abused, because all you had to do is vaguely know an MP and they would just frank your post for you. But these letters in this context that we're talking about, particularly in today, it is really about preserving and expanding relationships as people are almost pushed apart due to marriage, due to circumstance, isn't it? And one of the terms that might come up in the context of that is something called the familiar letter. So do you maybe, Natasha, want to give people a bit of a brief explanation about what we mean when we talk about a familiar letter?
Yes, the familiar letters are what novels like Pamela claim to be made up of. These are letters that are written, in that case, by a girl to her parents, to her family. So it's an intimate relationship. It's the difference with a business letter is that a business letter is meant to do something or to do something practical, or to communicate something practical. Whereas with a familiar letter, the letter is the point. The letter writing is the point. And often they talk about the fact that they're still able to write to each other, even if they don't have anything to really communicate. That the point is the conversation. They often talk about letter writing as being akin to conversation or a substitute for conversation. So sometimes it's an effective substitute. It makes them feel like they're almost physically present to each other. Sometimes they note that it's an inadequate substitute because all they can see is the pen and paper, and what they really want is their friend there. But the role of it is to be that kind of sociable expression. And this is a period when sociability and politeness is very important. So conversation and keeping conversation going and being together and entertaining each other is something that is an important element of society. And then the letters are an extension of that.
I think what you touch on there about some of these letters just being a way of kind of preserving relationships is not just about people necessarily of the same age either, is it? These are relationships that can exist when people are young in the same way as we would write postcards or messages or do a Zoom call. Like one of my favorite examples of that you've shared in things is actually one from Mary Gray, who we'll talk about the Grays in a bit. And this is when she's 6 years old. So do you want to provide a bit of context to the letter before I read it out?
Yes, the great thing about children's letters is that they show them learning how to write letters, that this is something that is being taught to them and that they're practicing. And as you say, she is 6 years old. She is away from home for the first time. She's been sent to Brighton for her asthma to bathe in the sea. So she's writing home, and you can see her kind of adapting some of those letter writing conventions, but from the point of view of a 6-year-old, which makes it very cute.
And I'll read the text on this. So imagine this listener's in the voice of a 6-year-old, not mine. But I am afraid you will think this dull letter, but I told sister that this place does not afford news. Pray my duty to my dear mama and love to sister. I am dear papa. Your most dutiful daughter, Mary Gray. P.S. On Sunday last, I saw for the first time a rainbow. Like, that P.S. is just, to me, just beautiful. And again, it just is so humanizing. But as you say, shows also that this is a culture that's being developed from an early age, so that as people get older, as women get age, they are already part of that letter writing community and that letter writing desire.
And we've got letters from her mother saying that she shouldn't be worried about writing to me. Just try to write down it exactly as you would talk if we were together. So again, that's introducing that idea of letters writing as conversation and making sure that even small children are beginning to be initiated into that. But also that the thing about, you'll think this is a dull letter, but I told sister this place does not afford news. That's such a kind of formula for... you're meant to have news in a letter, some sort of either gossip or current events or something that you can report. And so she knows that this is something that a letter is meant to include, but of course she doesn't have any because she's 6.
And let's talk a bit about that. Let's dig into that a bit before we explore the specific characters we're viewing this few, and we've already mentioned now. But there are formulas that go alongside these letters that they're meant to follow, not rigidly, but there is a sort of established formula to these letters, isn't there? Maybe do you want to give listeners an idea of, let's say that it's to young women writing to each other, as we will look at with sisters, let's say, what's the rough format they're going to be engaging in when they're doing these letters?
Mm-hmm. There are letter writing manuals that are published. So as part of this expansion of letter writing, you have a lot of new people starting to write letters that perhaps weren't familiar with it. So this at all levels of society. So what letter writing manuals do is kind of explain to you how you're meant to do this. And with Richardson's Pamela, interestingly, he actually started off writing a letter writing manual. And as part of the examples he included within that, there was this story of a servant girl being pursued by her master, and that ended up growing into the novel. So you have instruction, but this is a literary exercise as well. It's not purely functional in the way that some of the more business writing is. And so they're very self-conscious about the fact that not only are they wanting to write a letter, but they're trying to write a letter well. So there are those formulas. You will start by asking about the recipient's health. You will report on your own health and how you're doing. You will give any news from your local area, comment on current events. And then you might end by giving compliments to everyone that the recipient is going to be with, so that they can pass those on. You might have a postscript about anything that you forgot to include. So there are those conventions, but also they often comment upon those conventions themselves. So they'll say, oh, this is such a formulaic way to start a letter. And I think you'll think that I'm very stupid and very dull. And because we're such close friends, we shouldn't have to stick to those formulas. And often they'll talk about the question of style as well. And So that's part of the process of learning to write letters, is to do them elegantly, to be expressive, to have descriptions. So something they include a lot is whenever they go somewhere or they do something, they will include, an in-depth description so that you almost feel like you were there. And you have to remember this is a period when they didn't have photographs. So if you want to, you want to tell someone about your holiday or the tour that you took of some country house or something remarkable that happened to you, you have to describe it in words. And that skill of description is one of the things that they are trying to cultivate.
So let's very briefly, just before we dig into some of the more detail around this, I think we should also flag that part of the reason for those conventions, part of the reason that, and something that does come up in these letters is obviously that because these letters can be quite intimate, because they can cover things that maybe are, as you say, they're conversational, that does lead sometimes to discussions even within those letters about what happens when people die. Because ultimately people worry about what will happen to their letters after they die. And we'll explore more of that later. But one thing that you've mentioned in one of your talks, and I'm going to read this out because I just think it's a really, really great way of summing this up, is that you describe letters as existing across multiple points in time. And I think it's worth us flagging to listeners that this is a thing that they were aware of at the time. They were aware that their letters might be preserved, they might be collected, and they'd often take steps or discuss what they would do after death or similar, wouldn't they?
Yes, absolutely. Because the difference between letters and conversation is that letters are much more permanent. Obviously, now we have recording technology, so conversations can be permanent as well, but they didn't at the time. So this is the way that you kind of set things down. And then once you've written it down, you can't really control what's going to happen to it. I've mentioned that they can be intercepted or opened in the post. But also once they arrive, often letters are read in family circles, in social settings. They might be read aloud. And that means that it's not an entirely private way of communicating. There's a lot of frustration, for example, that if a close friend of yours is staying with someone that both of you don't like, you can't write to them, frankly, because those letters are going to be read. And so I was just recently looking at a set of letters where they complain that they have to be very formal and formulaic because they can't say what they really feel, because they know that the letter is going to be shared. Or they might get passed on to other people. So if you have a description of something that's particularly interesting, like you've been to France, for example, you might write a letter about it to, your mother or your sister, and then she will pass it on to all of your other relatives and that saves you writing to all of them individually, but it means that letter becomes a much more public document. And some people might copy the letters that either they receive or they've been given in letter books and keep copies of them. And then you just lose control even more because now multiple copies exist and who knows what they're going to do with them. So this is always a kind of risk that exists. It's remarkable how many letters in the archives that I've read include instructions for the recipient to burn them after reading. And clearly those instructions weren't followed because they're still there for me to read.
Yeah, I find this particular aspect of it fascinating because it always reminds me of the oh my God, I've just posted in the wrong WhatsApp group thing. It's like, this is entirely possible within this framework. It's just the medium is different. Like, people are conscious of who might be reading the thing they are writing, even when they're writing private communications. So let's maybe explore some of the examples of this now and the people involved in this through the perspective of the Greys, who you have a book coming out about them soon. I think it's the perfect framing for many of the things we've talked about already. So there's sort of 4 key figures here that we're going to discuss over the next few minutes of this podcast, listeners. And do you maybe, Natasha, do you want to introduce them?
Yes, of course. So we start with kind of a trio of young women in the early part of the 18th century. And they meet as teenagers and they kind of share interests in books and writing. And they are Jemima Campbell, who at the age of 17 becomes Marchioness Grey in her own right when her grandfather dies. So she's kind of suddenly turns from an ordinary, minor aristocrat young girl to someone who's one of the highest peeresses of the realm. And she gets married at the same time. So that completely transforms her life. And then you've got her two closest friends. One of them is technically her aunt, although they're about the same age. They grow up together, which is Lady Mary Grey, who later marries and becomes Lady Mary Gregory. And then their third friend is Catherine Talbot, who is known as a blue-stocking writer. She's kind of a child prodigy at this time. And they're all very intelligent, very well-educated. And they sort of form this really close friendship that endures for the rest of their lives. But because Jemima has married, then Mary marries as well. Catherine Talbot has her own responsibilities. Her guardian becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. So they are separated physically, and therefore they have to rely on letters to maintain this friendship. And the fact that a lot of those letters have survived, partially, as we'll discuss, but they give a record of these women's lives and their relationships and their friendship.
And there's another character we'll come to a bit more later, which is Amabel Grey, isn't it?
Yes. So Jemima Grey becomes Marchioness, and she inherits Rest Park, which is her grandfather's country estate. And she marries Philip York, who is the son of the Lord Chancellor. So it's this very great marriage between two young people that happens to be very successful because they have a lot of interests in common. But it's intended to kind of create an heir or multiple heirs for these great families. But what happens is that they have two daughters. And so little Mouse, who was the little girl that we mentioned earlier, Brighton, she is the younger of their two daughters.
So let's talk a bit then about the kind of things they're discussing in these letters and what they're talking about. So you talked about how this is a way of preserving the conversations between people, and they're a really nice window into that, aren't they? Because they are generally covering the areas that we would expect everyone in these situations to be covering. So what are the kind of topics that they are regularly corresponding about?
They talk a lot about books because their friendship starts off with them sharing books in common. This is something that they continue to talk about, what they're reading, what they think about it, recommending things to each other. They talk about current affairs. There's quite a lot about, for example, the Jacobite Rebellion in 1745 and them reacting in real time to this as this happens. They don't know what's going to happen, so there's a lot of uncertainty and fear around this. Politics, family affairs, gossip about people they know, and kind of society events. A lot of more philosophical reflections about what the purpose of life is and how you can feel content in life. Particularly, Catherine Talbot is, I think, prone to depression or kind of an anxious self-examination for a lot of her life. And so they kind of counsel each other on how to respond to things. So yeah, it's very varied. Often it's very intimate. Of course, as a kind of historian studying these, there's always gaps. There's always more things you want to know. There's a lot of things that they don't talk about or that haven't survived in the letters that we have. So you are always kind of trying to fill in the blanks. Often the things that are kind of the most intimate or the most closest to their hearts, they kind of talk around. And therefore you have to piece things together to figure out exactly what happened.
Yeah, and I'd imagine that's one of the challenges of this, is because, I mean, I've seen this looking at letters from soldiers in World War One, letters both home and to each other post-war, where you're often trying to rebuild, almost fill those gaps, because sometimes they're talking about things in a way where they know the context and they know that they will understand it. But in a similar way to what you've talked about earlier, they're also very aware that the letters might be read by someone else. So there is a lot of talking around things. There's a spectacular example of that fantastic study. If I can find it, I'll link to it in the footnotes, which is actually familiar letters from wives of American servicemen in World War One after the American servicemen return, in which they are very much talking around the fact that now their husbands seem to be very, very, very much better in bed. And this is very clearly because the French women have taken no prisoners in telling their men that they are crap in bed and telling them how to be better at it. And it's the interesting dialogue around that, not just the kind of the sexual awakening around that, but also that they know it's not a topic they can really be talking about, and therefore they talk around it. But one thing I found fascinating around this era and everything else is, and you mentioned it right at the beginning there, is there could be listen, you might be tempted to think that this is very Jane Austen-esque, and it's just they're talking about marriages and they're talking about who likes who and who doesn't. And obviously, as you say, that does come up. But yeah, things like their reaction to the Jacobite rebellions, their beliefs on politics, they are having these opinions. Just because those opinions aren't reflected in mainstream writing doesn't mean they're not having those opinions. And that really does come through in these letters, doesn't it?
Exactly. And it's remarkable how much political discussion there is, because I think we have this idea of there being separate spheres in the 18th century, this idea that, the men had their own sphere of politics and business and money, and they talked about those things, whereas the women were just at the tea table talking about marriage and gossip. Whereas even a lot of the women that I look at are highly intelligent, highly educated, but even the ones who aren't so much, you've got certain women who are particularly interested in their lapdogs and their birds and their garden, and that's mostly what they talk about. And clearly, there's not a great deal of intellectual content in their letters, but they still talk about politics, and they still understand what's going on with politics and what the maneuvers are and the kind of different shifting alliances and parties, and they take an interest and have opinions. So that's one of the things that letters gives you, is it breaks down that idea that there were particular areas that women were involved in and that men were involved in. So even though these women, they couldn't vote, they not only had strongly held opinions, but they made them felt in various ways, either through discussions with their husbands or fathers, or interference with election campaigning quite often, because this is a time when, aristocrats have a certain sphere of influence where they basically tell their tenants how to vote. And this is a role that women exercise quite strongly in this period as well.
Yeah, because, presumably if Jemima had been a man, she'd have sat in the House of Lords.
This is something that her daughter, Amabel, is highly aware of. Amabel is someone who's very interested in politics. Far more than anyone else. She publishes books on the French Revolution. She has extremely strongly held views. And once her mother dies and she inherits, she knows that if she had been a man, she would have been Marquis Grey, and she would have sat in Parliament. And she has this letter where she talks about how she imagines herself as Marquis Grey. But then she says, I would have been shot for the vehemence of my opinions. Because this is a time when people did call each other out in duels and the Prime Minister was assassinated. So she knows that she feels strongly enough that she wouldn't have made a lot of friends in Parliament. And so she ends by saying that I must beat the bars of my gilded cage. So there is a level of frustration knowing that she can't get as involved as she wants to be. And she has to publish her political works anonymously. And then she hears people discussing them. And she can't say that it's her. She can't speak up and say that she is this great expert on the French Revolution. So there's a kind of both a pleasure and a frustration in that.
And does that come through in her own letters? We'll talk more about her in a bit, but because she's almost, from listeners, it's perhaps best to think of her as adjacent to what we're talking about with Jemima, with Catherine, with Mary, is that Amabel's going to really come into it after Jemima's death, but she's a prolific letter writer, she's a prolific diarist, and she's one of my favorite characters from this entire period. And I absolutely hate the fact that she is that classic thing of, if you go on Wikipedia and look up Amabel Grey, you're going to find about 3 paragraphs about someone who was enormously influential in her own way, who wrote so much stuff that's still interesting to read now, even just her regular publishing stuff beyond the letters. But it's the classic thing of like just absolute underrepresentation, where she's literally just like, here's 3 paragraphs about her. Oh, by the way, she's in a painting that's in the National Gallery. It's that. But
And good luck finding her in the first place, because one of the problems with these women is that they're always indexed under their husbands' names, which for the Grey family, interestingly, wasn't true. So this is a little sidebar, but when Jemima inherits from her grandfather, the Duke of Kent, one of the stipulations is that they have to continue inheriting, they have to take the name Grey. So this is why she is Jemima Grey and her daughters are Mary and Amabel Grey, even though their father was Philip York. So in all of the indexes and the databases, they'll be under York, they'll be under their husbands' names, but they will never be under Grey. So that makes them even more difficult to find in the archives.
And so that's the thing listeners to take from this is that when people are exchanging letters, when women are exchanging letters in this period, they are not just, yes, they are conversational. Yes, they are familiar. Let's say having these things, but it is a genuine mix of the stuff they're talking about. This is not just formulaic. What I saw, I was on holiday. Did you see that guy that we all fancy? It's not that. Like those are elements that can be present, but this is genuine and incredibly useful from a historical perspective context on what's happening in the world and what's happening around that. But I mean, I love that they're even aware of this as they're writing them. So there's a fantastic letter that you've shared before, which is it's Jemima Grey to Mary Grey. And it's you agree with me, I believe, in loving familiar letters naturally and freely wrote better than almost any sort of reading. The accounts that may be gathered from them on the customs and way of living of the Romans at that time, and several characters drawn in them, make them, I think, very amusing. Like, they know that these letters are providing a window, and also that letters that their own family and people in the past have written are providing that window as well, don't they?
Exactly. So they like to read letters quite a lot themselves. They're all interested in history. And not only do they read these epistolary novels as they come out, but they're also reading the letters of Pliny, the letters of Madame de Sévigné, who is a 17th century French writer. And they are highly influenced by them. And they're aware of these models, and they're aware of the fact that these are letters that have survived over time. And that might happen with their own as well. And there's also a kind of a scale of quality of letters. So there is a sense that some letters might be better than others or more worth preserving. So something that they say often about Jemima is that her letters are worth preserving because they contain so much detail and information and kind of commentary on events. They call there's a family joke where they call them nanny goats rather than anecdotes. So, something that her letters contain a lot of are these nanny goats, which are things that are kind of worth preserving because they're entertaining or amusing or shed light upon something that's going on. And so while there might be a lot of letters out there, the ones that are worth keeping and worth publishing are in a kind of category of their own.
Yeah, and Jemima's very aware of that. That comes through in the letters. She's really aware of that. She knows that there's a good chance her letters will be preserved. And actually, that's probably where story doesn't necessarily take a dark turn, but it does take a very self-aware turn. Because when she does die, her instruction is very much that she does not want them preserved. She gives explicit instruction to Amabel, to her executors, to burn all her letters, doesn't she?
Yeah, this is something that they think about a lot over the course of their lives, particularly as they start to get older and as people start to die. Because every time that someone dies, there is this, if they've kept all the letters they've received, which people tend to, there is a kind of this mass of paper that is left behind them. And the question is, what do we do with that? And often it's returned to the authors of the letters. But then when the authors of the letters die, there's a kind of a cumulative effect where these things pile up and up. And on one hand, all of these people are very interested in history. They're interested in old documents, in state papers, in the act of preservation, and what that how helpful that might be to future historians and future people studying the period. On the other hand, they want privacy. They don't want all of their most intimate business to be kind of out there forever. And there's a kind of question of decorum as well. You never, even for letters that are published in this period, you never want to say that you want your letters to be published. There's always a kind of modesty trope that comes in where you always say, of course, no, of course, I would never want this. And so there's a tension there between their tendency to preserve and revisit and keep everything, and this desire to kind of tidy everything away so there's there's nothing that can shed kind of a bad light on anyone after their death, or embarrass anyone, or basically make anyone uncomfortable. So the safest option is just to burn everything, but that's not something they're really capable of, given that they know how valuable this material is.
And this is very much in our kind of story that we or narrative that we're talking about today. This is very much where Amabel comes into play in another way, doesn't she? Because I think one thing that I find really interesting with her is because we've got diaries and letters, you can see in her diary her genuine angst about knowing that her mother's request is that her letters be destroyed. But Amabel knows that there's some real valuable material in there that should be preserved. And you can see in her diary her personal conflict between, do I go against my mother's wishes, or more, how do I comply with my mother's wishes while also not complying with them and preserving this stuff? And she has an interesting solution to that, I think, doesn't she?
Yes. So she inherits this massive amount of material from her parents and from their friends. And she spends a lot of time putting it in order and a lot of time revisiting it and reading it, some of them out loud to her friends. I mean, you have to keep in mind there's a very strong emotional element here as well. Her parents have died. All the people that she's kind of grown up with, all of her original mentors have died. She's in her 40s and 50s. And she's a historian. So on one hand, she wants to keep that connection to the past, to the people that she loved. She doesn't want to destroy that. On the other hand, she knows that there is a value that might extend beyond herself, that these are interesting in their own right. And she also knows that this is a period, we're now in the very beginning of the 19th century, when a lot of collections of letters are being published from the previous generation. So the letters of Samuel Richardson, for example, and all his correspondence, and the letters between Catherine Talbot and another of her friends, Elizabeth Carter, they're published, all of them posthumously. So Amabel calls it this letter-loving age in which everything private becomes public. And she enjoys reading these collections. She buys them, but she's also kind of very disapproving of the concept. She knows that the people would have never wanted their letters to be published. And so she's kind of stuck in his bind. And what she ends up doing, ultimately, is that she starts her own edition of her mother's correspondence, which is not going to be a print edition. It's in manuscript. It's in these 9 large manuscript volumes, ultimately. She doesn't intend it to be published, but she does want to keep it in some way. And what this edition looks like is in many ways like the print editions that are appearing at this time. She selects extracts from the letters, the things that she finds most interesting, most worth preserving. She edits them. She adds often footnotes or explanations. She redacts some of the proper names. So she creates this kind of manuscript edition, and we know that she shared it with her cousin, certainly, and maybe some of other family members. But apart from that, it remains in the archives. And once she's finished this edition, which is a massive undertaking, it's about 300,000 words. It takes 9 volumes. It takes her about 20 years, during which time she is starting to lose her eyesight. So it's really a labor of love. And as soon as she's finished it, she finally burns the originals. And so finally she's able to fulfill what her mother originally asked her to do. But again, she keeps to the letter of the will. Any letters that she wasn't requested to burn, she doesn't burn, because she does want this to still be around in some way. I don't know what use she envisaged for them. I would imagine that if she envisaged them as staying within the family rather than being rifled through by me. But it's very fortunate that these things have survived in whatever form.
Yeah, I mean, and this is one of both the sad, but also I find quite humbling as a historian aspects of things. So, for example, I've got in my collection a copy of a very privately published memoir of a guy called Gary Kildall, who was very key in the early home computing revolution, very troubled man in his own way, with alcoholism and things like that. Key figure, died tragically young in a bar fight, but he, towards the end of his life, wrote a memoir of his thing, but he didn't publish it. He only circulated it to a number of family members, and there is now a available version that his children later made available, but it's only the first half, because of how troubled he was, the second half is a difficult read, and it's not necessarily kind to people that maybe he would have been kinder to at different times of his life. I'm very privileged to have access to the full version, but even when I've read it, I've never used anything from that section in what I've published on him, because, as you say, that you feel like you're being given an insight into something that was never meant to be consumed outside of the family. And even though the family have graciously allowed me access to that, you're like, actually, where's my duty lie as a historian versus where does my duty lie to the people I'm part of the lives of? And you must feel that a fair bit when you look at and study letters.
Absolutely, because you are reading other people's posts, basically. So there's an ethical consideration there. Unfortunate in some ways that, this is 200-300 years in the past. So that lets me feel that the statute of limitations has passed a little bit. But often this kind of work is done by descendants, and I'm not a descendant, and I'm very aware of that. And in many ways, I'm very opposite to the kinds of values that they represent. These people were very conservative. They were aristocrats. Amabel in particular had very strongly conservative and reactionary political views. And I don't think they would have been fans of me at all. But I think that's one of the benefits of history and of time passing, is that we can come to re-examine these things through different lenses and through different eyes. So on one hand, there's a lot that I find very relatable and fun and entertaining about these letters, but I'm always conscious there is that distance as well, that I'm not coming to this as one of them. But I think that's fine. I think as time passes, we have these opportunities to have new perspectives, basically.
And again, I think some of these letters they're fascinating, both the ones that don't deal with heavy material and the ones that do deal with heavy material are equally fascinating and equally useful. I mean, and just as another example, from some of the ones you've shared, I love this one, which is and is relevant to things that have happened on camera with regards to torties. But I arrived here a little after 2 very present days' journey, and we met with very good inns, which you may tell Papa, who was apt to abuse them. And both days we had excellent chickens and puddings. You'll be surprised to hear that we set out 5 from London, yet we came here 6 in the coach. And you will wonder when I tell you that the 6th was a kitten. I love that you get those elements as much as you get those discussions on the politics and everything else. And it really does remind us that, as you say, these are people. These are people at the heart of these things. And they're people with the same different attitudes maybe, but the same drives that we have now. And maybe we'll finish this regular section of the podcast, I think, is I almost like the idea of maybe giving the last word to Amabel, because as we've talked about, she really did kind of have angst over the emotional attachment to her mother's letters, how to preserve them and how to honor her memory. And I wondered if maybe you'd be kind enough to maybe just give Amabel the last word on the main section here by reading from her diary what she writes on the 13th of October, 1821?
Yes, of course. So this is when she has finished her great 9-volume edition. On this day, I finished my few remaining extracts from my mother's letters to Miss Talbot, and burnt the small remains of her correspondence. I was not enjoined to burn Miss Talbot's letters, and therefore have preserved them. I hope I have not too far transgressed the injunctions of my mother's will by keeping any extracts of her letters. But I could not bear entirely to destroy a correspondence which I really thought superior to many that have been favoured by general applause.
I think that really captures both her dilemma and her solution. And to me also, why she is genuinely an incredible picker from this period. And I do encourage you listeners to try and dig into a bit more about her. We will talk more in a second for subscribers. Subscribers, you're going to get both the what did we not cover that we should have talked about, but absolutely we are definitely going to talk about the joy that is when you have the original letter versus the extract, and you can see what the scurrilous bit was that they left out when they preserved the extract. So we'll have a bit of that in the extra bit for your enjoyment. But Natasha, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find more about you now, and when is the book due out as well?
So thank you so much for having me. My website is natashasimonova.com, and it's got details on all of my publications and things that I've done. When the book is coming out is a difficult question when I finished writing it, which is proven to be very much a movable feast, but we shall see at some point.
Yeah, know that one well as an author. Well, look, follow Natasha. We will absolutely make sure I will make sure I alert you when the book does come out, because I will be waving my own copy around. But thanks very much for joining me, and we'll talk a bit more in a second. But listeners, main podcast listeners, we'll leave you there. As usual, I just want to remind you that because we're a general history podcast, because we want to bring you stories from across different eras, from across different spectrums, that makes it far harder for platforms like YouTube or Spotify to know when to recommend this podcast to people. If we were a podcast that only ever talked about Hitler and sharks, it would know exactly who to serve us up to. But as we talk about everything from ship's cats to Warhammer to the joy that is 17th century letter writing, we're more dependent than ever on you spreading the word that the podcast exists. So leave us a review on your pod app of choice. Leave a comment if you can. Tell someone on WhatsApp that you love the podcast. Just spread things by word of mouth, and that helps us reach the people who will enjoy this podcast. So thank you for listening. And if you're interested in the extra bit that we're going to talk about now, then don't forget you can go to untitled-history.com and you can subscribe there to become a member. That gives you access to ad-free podcasts, but it also gives you access to all the extra bits that we're talking about. And increasingly, the library of weird stuff I am finding on the internet that normally only lives in my head, which I will share and post to you. So we have weekend watches of the random stuff I found on YouTube, and increasingly we're going to have more content up there on time. And there's a nice little community that you can discuss with other people about subjects of the episodes. So main pod listeners, we will leave you there, and then we will get on. Extra listeners, hang around, because we're going to talk more about letters. You've been listening to the Untitled History Podcast, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, why not head over to our dedicated supporter page? There, for the cost of a cup of tea, you can decide which subjects we cover next, get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and join a community of like-minded people. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. You may have encountered these sort of the epistolar. I'm terrible at saying this word. Is it the epistolatory word?
I've heard it both ways.
Yeah, we're talking here about the sort of the 17th century, so the 1800s, the 16th.
The 16th.
I need coffee this morning.